This video is going to go through translations of core functions. Now all of you, I'm sure, are used to functions like y equals the absolute value of x. It's the v function. You've got another core function would be y equals x squared. Basic parabola with its vertex at the origin. Y equals x to the third. Things like that. Three others you probably are aware of. 1 over x, that is in the first quadrant, and the third quadrant. And y equals the square root of x. The arm going off into the first quadrant. And then some of you probably were taught the core function, some of you maybe not, but y equals the square root of 1 minus x squared. And that is kind of half of an upside down circle. And it goes from negative 1 on the x-axis to 1 on the y-axis, back to 1 on the x-axis. So those are our 6 core functions, and we're going to translate them. So rules of translation are, if we have a function, and we'll write down our rules in function notation. So I'm going to write a few of them down. If we took f of x and added 3 externally to that, I say externally as opposed to f of x plus 3, which would be adding internally. If we did plus 3 externally, that's going to be a vertical shift, or move that up 3. So if we had something like f of x minus 2, that's going to move the function down 2. If we add f of x plus 3 with the plus 3 internal, that's going to be a horizontal shift, and that's going to shift it the opposite of what the sign is. So that's going to move it to the left 3. If we had f of x minus 2, that's going to move the function to the right 2. Okay, so we have up and down our outside, left and right our inside, and then we have our reflections over the x-axis and the y-axis. And that comes from a multiplication of negative 1. If we multiply by negative 1 internally, so f of negative x, so this is internal as opposed to external, which is the opposite of f of x. If the negative 1 is internal, that reflects over the y-axis. And if the negative is external, that reflects over the x-axis. Okay? So think external, x-axis. So for example, if we wanted to graph y equals x minus 4, quantity squared, plus 1. First we start with our core graph. It's an x squared core graph, so that's our parabola. Center at the origin, but I'm going to draw it very lightly because that's not going to be our answer. We're going to translate that. This is going to move it to the right 4. And this is going to move it up 1. So I'm going to take this graph, I'm going to move it to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 1. So its vertex is now here, still opens upward. So our final graph would look like that. Okay, another example. Let's say we have y equals the square root of x minus 3 internally and minus 2 externally. So it's going to be, again lightly, our core graph is going to be the square root of x graph. The minus 3, this is going to move it to the right 3. The negative 2 is going to move it down 2. So I take the center, move it to the right 3, move it down 2, so it looks exactly like that graph, but it's translated this way. Another example. Let's take y equals the absolute value of negative x plus 1. So, this is our absolute value graph, which is our V shape. Our negative 1 is multiplied internally. Since it's internally, we're going to reflect it over the y-axis, so it's going to look exactly the same. Now we're going to move it up 1. So our final graph would look like that. Okay. And next, if we had y equals the opposite of the absolute value of x minus 3, now our negative sign is external, so we're going to take our V-shaped graph, reflect it over the x-axis, meaning it's going to go downward, and move it down 3. So it will look like that. There is a catch to be aware of. If we wanted to graph y equals the square root of negative x plus 3. Now, a lot of times a common mistake would be to look at this and say, well, the plus 3, that's internal, so that's going to move it to the left 3, and the negative 1 is internal, so that's going to reflect it over the y-axis. However, when you have two things going on inside of the graph, inside of the function, you have to think of it this way. Take that negative 1 and factor that out first, so it's going to be negative 1 times x minus 3. So this graph actually is going to reflect over the y-axis, but it's going to move to the right 3. So when you graph this, it's our core graph that looks like this, the square root of x. It's going to reflect over the y-axis, so then it looks like this, and that's going to move it to the right 3. 1, 2, 3. So our final graph looks like that. A similar example, if we had y equals quantity negative x minus 5, quantity squared. Again, you might look at it and say it should go to the right 5 because it has a negative 5 internal. However, you have to remember that we need to think of this as negative 1 times x plus 5 quantity squared. So it's going to move to the left 5. It's going to be reflected over the y-axis. So we take our parabola centered at the origin, reflected over the y-axis. It looks exactly the same. Move it to the left 5. And so the final graph would look like that. So let's say we're given the three functions. F of x is 1 over x. Remember what that one looks like. G of x is the square root of x, and h of x is the square root of 1 minus x squared. That's that half a circle opening downward. And we wanted to graph g of x minus 2 plus 1. That means we're going to take the function g, we're going to move it to the right 2 units, and move it up 1. It's just a little bit different notation. We're taking our graph that looks like this, square root of x, and moving it to the right 2 and up 1. So that final graph would look like that. If we wanted to, let's say, find the opposite of the h of x minus 3. So this multiplication is external, so it's going to flip that half of a circle over the x-axis. So now it's going to be opening upward and move down 3. So our original graph looks like this. It's going to flip over the x-axis, so it looks like that. Move it down 3. So it was centered here. It's going to go down 1, 2, 3. That's going to be the center of it. And our final answer will look like that. So just to recap quickly, we had our 6 core functions that we talked about, and then we wanted to do different translations of those, and to put those translations, if we add or subtract internally or externally, it's going to move it up or down, depending on if it's plus or minus. If we add or subtract internally, we add 3, it's going to move it to the left 3. We do a minus 2, it's going to move it to the right 2. And the multiplication, those are where we flip the graph or reflect it. If we multiply by -1 internally, it's going to reflect over the y-axis. -1 externally, it's going to reflect over the x-axis.